Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my utmost pleasure to welcome you at tonight's event at Globart Academy. Thank you so much for coming. Before I will we can give over the word to our keynote speaker today, Jeffrey Sachs and Fred Lux, we would like to take a few moments to let you know what the upcoming programs will be tonight after the keynote speech. My great colleague, Eva Maria, is going to say some words to the upcoming programs. One of them is a performance by Lucia Derrico, and afterwards Fighting Theories, Desire Boxes by Bass Collective Arno Böhle and Susanne Granzer.
Yes, also from my side, welcome to this evening program. To say a few words about the continuous program after this evening's lecture. So right after the lecture there will be a musical performance by Lucia Derrico, which will be taking place downstairs in our concert room where the piano is. Lucia Derrico is a musician and artistic researcher with a strong focus on experimental performance, practices and transdisciplinarity. She is author of several books, among them Powers of Divergence, an experimental approach to music performance, and also the co-editor of Artistic Research, Charting a Field in Expansion. As a research fellow at the Orpheus Institute in Belgium, she was part of the artistic research project Music Experiment X, funded by the ERC, in which she explored notions of experimentation in the performance of Western notated art music. And the title of her performance that was created exclusively for the Globart Academy today will be Powers of Divergence, a Voyage Out of Music. So we will welcome you to see that downstairs in the concert room. And after this musical performance, we will even continue with our club format, as Blanca already announced. So the club will take place here, upstairs again, in this room. And there you will have the chance to explore the performative installation Desire Boxes by Arno Böhle, Susanne Valerie Granzer, Lea Susemichel and Johanna Braun. And yes, we would also love to welcome you at this philosophical late night shift, so to say, taking place here upstairs again. Okay, and now, I wish you a pleasant time with our keynote speaker of tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Mr. Fred Lux.
Good evening, Mr. Sachs, Mr. Novotny. My name is Fred Lux. I have the pleasure to be the moderator tonight. And we have Jeffrey Sachs, one of the most famous economists of our time, I would say, very closely related to this that you all know, I hope, 17 Goals for Sustainable Development. He was instrumental, one could say, for that process and for this system of goals. He has worked on development economics, public health, macroeconomic theory, economic geography, and I could go on and on and on. And he has really a lot of fields, and he's probably one of the most influential person in terms of fight against poverty and in terms of the fight for sustainable development. I'm German, and when I came to Austria, I learned an expression, weltberühmt in Österreich, world famous in Austria. And tonight we have a person that is actually world famous in the world. So welcome, Jeffrey Sachs.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I really treasure being famous in Globart. We're so thrilled to be part of this wonderful, wonderful organization and the Globart Academy. So when Heidi Marie asked us to come for this year's celebration, I think the answer was immediate yes, and we're so lucky to be together with you. You gave away my punchline. The economy of well-being is the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, so I will take you out of suspense. But I will explain why, and I'll spend about 30 minutes describing why we're in a little bit of a mess, and we feel that mess throughout the world right now. Rousseau said 200 years ago that man is born free and is everywhere in chains. And I think we could say today that we are born rich, and yet poverty and destruction is all around us. And this is the paradox, really. Why do we have an economy that doesn't deliver what is important for human beings? That doesn't deliver an economy that gives a sense of satisfaction, a sense of dignity, and also protects the planet so that we're not destroying the very basis of our prosperity. And I think the basic argument is we don't have our heads put on in the right way right now. The problems are not primarily technological. They are obviously political in important ways, but beyond politics is the way we think about the economy, the way we talk about it, the way we reason about it, the way we measure the economy. We're not fulfilling what we could be fulfilling. And it's easy for me to know it in the United States because we are among the most paradoxical places in the world. We're about as rich an economy as is imaginable, and yet we have about the worst president one could ever imagine, a true psychopath. And we have a growing social crisis alongside an economic boom looked at over the course of a generation. So the contrast in the United States is absolutely stark. We're at $65,000 income per man, woman, and child. That's a lot of money. At that level, we actually could have roads that are not broken down. We could have bridges that are not falling down. We could arrive back at our airports in the United States and not have all the elevators broken, all the escalators not working, all of the 2-mile walk to get the taxis because all the broken infrastructure doesn't function. In other words, it's really an odd situation. So for many, many years, I've been trying to understand the US situation, but obviously it's a more general problem, though I think rather stark in the US. We lack nothing in the United States except some decency and a better way to understand our situation. So I want to talk about the economy of well-being from ancient wisdom to modern solutions, and let's see where we can get to. The idea for me is the economy of eudaimonia, or I think the right pronunciation is eudaimonia, in the way that Aristotle would have said it. Although, God, I would love to have a chat with him to know. But the basic idea is that Aristotle had a good thought and a basic thought, which is that the economy and the politics ought to be organized to promote the well-being of people. And he wrote 2 rather good books about that. One, the Nicomachean Ethics, written 2,350 years ago. That was advice for his son Nicomachus. And while we use ethics in a different way, mainly in a Kantian way of right and wrong, Aristotle used it mostly in a good advice manner of what's the right way to live. So not so much right and wrong, but good and bad. And he gave some very good practical advice to his son and to Western civilization for the next 2,000 years about what the good would be. He wrote a companion volume that is quite literally designed to be the companion, and that is called The Politics, written at the same time or collated by his students at the same time. And The Politics opens up with the idea that politics is about promoting eudaimonia of the community. So it is ethics at the level of the polis rather than at the level of the individual. These are two very good books. In fact, I often note for myself in incredible, insane academic envy, they are the best two books ever written on the subject. So Aristotle invented the field of ethics. He invented the field of political science. He wrote the first two books in the two fields, and they remain the best two books ever written in the field because basically we just keep rewriting the same thing, better or worse, not better, slightly worse than Aristotle wrote it. But we're still trying to get to this question of the economy of eudaimonia, of well-being. And the paradox is a world of wealth, and just to quantify it for you, the world output, adding up output sold on markets around the world each year, is about $100 trillion now for 7.7 billion people. So the average output per person on the planet is about $12,000 per person. Not bad, actually, as the average over the whole world. In the rich countries, it's about $45,000 per person. In the poor countries, it's about $7,000 or $8,000 per person. But on average, that's riches beyond imagining from the point of view of a century ago, even a half century ago. After all, China, which is 20% of the world's population, had a 35-time increase of its marketed production during the last 40 years. And that's a scale of accomplishment that is one reason why the world economy is indeed so rich today. So I want to stipulate, we can talk about it more, that we're a rich world. But the paradox is we have 1 billion people that barely survive day to day. We have 1 billion people for whom one mosquito bite can be the difference of life and death because of malaria, which is 100% curable, but you need a doctor there or a nurse or a community health worker to give the pills. And even that minimum condition is not met. And we have 260 million school-age kids around the world not in school. That's crazy, because we have enough income to ensure that every child on this planet has a decent education. And yet in the poor countries, the completion rate for secondary education, in other words, the proportion of kids coming into first grade that finish 12th year, is around 20% or 25%. Can you believe what we do with the most important resource on this planet, our children? That we're not desperate about that fact, or desperate day to day knowing that 5 million kids will die under the age of 5 this year for completely preventable and treatable causes that could be stopped at almost no expense in the world if we had even a glimmer of care to do that. So, extreme poverty and deprivation, social exclusion, large parts of the world that just are not able to get a foothold into a decent life, starting with women in a lot of the world, who still face massive obstacles in the year 2019 to being able to finish school or to get training or to drive a car or to have a job or to be able to go outside of the household and so on. but also including almost every indigenous group in the whole world. If there's one consistency in the world, it's that every society hates its indigenous people. They are kind of witnesses to injustice, and there are about 400 million people in indigenous nations around the world, and they all face deprivation. They have faced genocides, exclusion, and it continues until today. And of course, environmental devastation. Why are we using our wealth not to protect ourselves, but to put the climate into devastating risk? We've already warmed the climate to beyond the temperatures of the last 10,000 years. We have polluted our oceans, as you know, whether it's the nitrogen or the phosphorus or the plastics or toxic chemicals or the antibiotics. We have air pollution, which claims more than 5 million deaths per year. And every one of those has a technological pathway and solution that if we, I was going to say if we took a deep breath, but a lot of places in the world you don't want to take a deep breath. But if we thought about it for just a bit, we would know here is a path to safety. Thank God we're so rich. Thank God we have the technologies, but we don't act. This is basically the paradox. And the argument that I will make in a long anticipated book in my household, not written yet, but written in my head mostly, is of course the argument that our problem is a false anthropology. We have a wrong theory of human beings, a wrong approach, and of course it is based on psychological and ethical egoism that has gotten wildly out of control, that neither reflects our human nature nor guides us from our self-understanding or the design of our social institutions to be able to use our knowledge and our wealth in an effective way. And we have a false theology, and a false theology that is very prevalent in the United States, increasingly prevalent in other parts of the world, that is in the US context called the prosperity gospel. What it says is, in essence, if you're poor, it's your own fault. If you're poor, maybe it's you're lazy and shiftless, or in the literal theological sense, Americans are told every week by their televangelist preachers, if you're poor, it's that you just don't believe in God enough. It's a sign that you are just not in the comfort of God, because God gives wealth to his believers. And so if you would just deposit a little bit more money in our televangelical church, we promise it will multiply wonderfully for you, but do understand that the problems of poverty are your own. And that is obviously part of our syndrome. Some of the exemplars of our false theology start famously with Margaret Thatcher, who memorably said, and you know there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. It's interesting, by the way, when you read the Politics, which you will all go home to do tonight, because it's probably been a few months since you read it. When Aristotle starts writing about the Politics, he starts with the community and then only later goes to the individual. And he says, of course, you have to start with the collectivity because that comes first. The individual is derivative of the community. Because he says, if you were describing a body, would you start by talking about a hand and a leg, an arm? No, you would talk about the whole body, then you would talk about the pieces. Well, the same with the society. But in radical individualism, you say there is no society. There's just individuals. And individuals are self-responsible according to Margaret Thatcher and according to the prevailing libertarian views of the United States and so on. Now, in the US, we're even worse on all of this because a rather terrible dime novelist became known as a philosopher in the United States, Ayn Rand. She's wrote terrible novels, which are the favorites of our 15-year-olds and our members of Congress. And she is known as a philosopher, but she was a very unhappy person and a very nasty person, actually, and got her own personal life tangled up in a complete mess, which is, according to philosophical theory, one measure of philosophy is how it does for the philosopher. But she also led an idea which is our extreme individualism known as libertarianism. And in the most famous treatment of libertarianism in Ayn Rand, there's a 100-page speech by her character John Galt in Atlas Shrugged. The Ubermensch that has withdrawn the support of society, created a crisis, and then he comes out to speak to the country to explain that the powerful people have been mistreated by all of the takers from society, and the rich people, the powerful people are not going to have it anymore. And John Galt explains the following: to help a man who has no virtues, to help him on the ground of his suffering, to accept his faults, his need as a claim, is to accept the mortgage of a zero on your values. In other words, to help the poor is a denigration of your self-worth. And I remember shuddering in the middle of the night as I was reading this a few years ago. It just actually had me breaking out in a sweat. Be it only a penny you will not miss, or a kindly smile that he has not earned, a tribute to a zero to a beggar is a treason to life and to all those who struggle to maintain it. It is of such pennies and smiles that the desolation of your world was made. In other words, if you as much smile at a beggar, if you give a few pennies that you will never need, you are leading to the desolation of the world. This is one of the most popular philosophies in America, or philosophers in America. So it is an absolute pathology of this individualism. So this is the result, a result of inequality, exclusion, environmental degradation, and anomie, the idea of alienation and a collapse of social norms, and a dislocation of individuals from feeling a part of society. And as Pope Francis has written, all of this comes without the discernment of individuals for self-correction, what Pope Francis calls the globalization of indifference, which is an astounding added feature to this. It's not as if we're sitting every day asking, how do we solve this problem? It is rather that the world goes on in this crisis with very little attention indeed to it. And this, I think, is the most alarming point of all. So we need a fresh start, and where better to start than in the School of Athens, of course, which happens to be my favorite place in the world in concept. All of these wonderful people, and my favorite picture in the world, of course, Raphael's School of Athens in the stanza of Raphael in the Vatican Museum, and Plato and Aristotle. Plato, of course, the elder gentleman pointing up to the sky and carrying Timaeus, his metaphysics, and Aristotle, the young man on the right, pointing to the earth and carrying ethics in his hand. And Raphael really got it right here. They both are fundamental for our Western philosophy, but Aristotle had some very important and down-to-earth things to say. And what he said that has resonated for 2,350 years starts with the theory of the soul. He said that all of us were made of three faculties of the soul. The soul meaning the animating spirit of human beings, the human nature. And he said part of the soul was what we share with all life, the vegetative soul, which is the urge and capacity of reproduction, nutrition, growth. The second soul is only of animals, and that is the perceptive soul, the soul of sensation, the ability to perceive and to move towards desirable things and to move away from undesirable or dangerous phenomena. And he called that the sensitive soul or the animal soul. And then his claim was that human beings alone of all the animals have the rational soul. And Plato had a division something like this as well. And at some metaphysical level, the rational soul is not only the uniquely human soul, but is also part of our capacity to appreciate the divine or the creation or God or something beyond in terms of ultimate meaning. But for Aristotle, the main point was, as human beings, we are conflicted. And this was before the Christian ideas of original sin or conflict and so forth. It was the basic, simpler idea, but very perceptive idea that we're conflicted because we're attracted in our animal soul to food, to wealth, to fame, to pleasures, to sex, whatever it is. But we know from our rational soul that that's not necessarily good for us to indulge in every temptation. And so the struggle for a good life for eudaimonia is to have our rational soul be able to choose the good and to tamp down the impulses that come from the animal soul. And he points out in Nicomachean Ethics, if there's a dog or a cat or an animal, it will be attracted instantly to a stimulus. It will go for the food, go for the sex, go for whatever it is, but only a human could say, wait a minute, really, I have to get to work. I shouldn't eat the fourth slice of cake. I have to control myself. That's not really good. And by using rationality, we can forge a good life. And that's the most basic idea of the Nicomachean Ethics. It is advice to Nicomachus. Keep calm, keep the middle course, don't let things run wild out of control. Use your brain, son. Use your human reason, son. Don't just go for the immediate stimulus. And that is Aristotle's core idea. And so this is elaborated in the best self-help volume, again, ever written. Because remember, the ethics is not Kantian, you ought to do this in Aristotle's terms. It is a self-help guide, how to live a good life. And what Aristotle said was, first, aim for the highest good. And for a human being, the highest good, your purpose, your telos, was to achieve rationality, to have your human reason guide you throughout life. So human reason is key, and the way to build that is to cultivate character. And so Aristotle was all about cultivating good character, what are called the virtues, or in Greek, arete, the excellences, but excellences of character. And they are the four great virtues that Aristotle talked about: practical wisdom, in Greek, phronesis; courage, or andreia; temperance, sophrosine; and justice, diokozene. These are traits that need to be developed over time, that need to be cultivated. We don't just come into life with them. You have to help your child to develop them. The teacher should help, the mentor should help, the good examples in society should help. We should tell our children, do not look at the President of the United States. The man's a goddamn wreck of a human being. And we know people who say when the presidential debates come on, you turn off the television because it's ungodly what's going to come. And so this is what Aristotle says about cultivating the virtues. He also says that human beings are zoon politikon, and political animals. We live in society. And he says anyone that wants to live alone is either a beast or a god. So Margaret Thatcher has it completely wrong. You can't start as individuals, you start as your social being. And that means be decent. Okay, he finally writes at the end of it, you want the best life, the absolute best life? To put it in modern parlance, he says, be a tenured professor of philosophy. Is that right, Johannes? Chapter 10. We have a great philosopher here, and perhaps some others as well. But he says contemplation is the greatest joy of all, because it gives you the window to the divine, also the window to understanding the universe, the window to something beyond yourself, or even the active life of politics. So basically, happiness is achieved through virtue. And if we want happiness, we have to think about how to build the virtues. And what's important in the dynamics in this picture is that the arrows go both ways. A virtuous state has virtuous citizens. If you have a corrupt president of the United States, he's a tax cheat, he's a liar, he's a psychopath, then it leads to mass shootings, it leads to violence, it leads to hate. And that's what we're experiencing in the United States. If you have the worst on top, you have the worst in society. But also to have, the problem is to have a good leader, you also have to have a virtuous society that's able to discriminate between the thugs and the not thugs. And so the dynamic is complicated. This is true also of the social virtues. If we don't even know what's right and wrong, if we've lost direction about what's decent or not decent behavior, then individuals lose their way also. That's the concept of anomie, of Durkheim and others. Of course, Jesus and Christian thought added importantly to those four virtues by adding the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, especially at the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes, which remember, beatitude is just the Latin translation of eudaimonia. Beatitudo is happiness. Eudaimonia is the Greek happiness. Jesus' lecture, his Sermon on the Mount, is a lecture about happiness, the same way. And a core idea, of course, in the Greco-Christian synthesis is that good works are therefore critical in achieving eudaimonia. And love of creation, St. Francis, is also critical in achieving eudaimonia. Okay, somehow we lost our way from this because these were actually very good ideas. And they are not our prevailing ideas today. Margaret Thatcher never heard of them. Donald Trump certainly never came across them. Most of our societies don't come across the idea that virtue is the path to happiness. It seems a little quaint. Maybe you hear it in Sunday school once. Maybe you hear about the 7 cardinal virtues and vices, but you have to memorize them for a quiz. It's not something that is core to our philosophy. Something happened. And I think it's fascinating, and I don't have time tonight to trace this, but I'm trying to trace it, as others have, how we went from this kind of view to philosophical and psychological egoism. Because we did fundamentally revert to an egoistic philosophy, morality, and psychology. And some of the high points of this, well, Machiavelli certainly played a role because he gave us the alternative theory of politics. If Aristotle's politics is the theory of the community achieving the common good, the polis achieving eudaimonia, then Machiavelli's theory of politics is the struggle for power. So Machiavelli gave us modern political science, at least one strand of it. He knew better. He was a brilliant thinker and historian and practitioner, but what we remember of Machiavelli mostly is that the prince should be conniving to hold power. And Machiavellian politics became, at least in the popular psychology, the dominant politics. Yeah, politicians are crooks and they just want to hold power. And there's a lot of truth to that because they live up to our image of what politics should be. The idea that politics is about well-being, it sounds a little quaint, doesn't it? That it should be the politics of happiness rather than the politics of power. Martin Luther also played a shocking role in this by basically denigrating the good works and individualizing radically the philosophy of the Protestant approach, saying that it's all between you and God, and it is by faith alone, after all. It is not by works that one achieves salvation or even happiness, it is by faith alone. Calvin, according to Weber, of course, added through the doctrine of predestination, let's just say a lot of anxiety, because there was nothing you could do for achieving your salvation, whether here or in an afterlife, but maybe wealth could be a signal, at least, according to Weber, of that you have been, that you are chosen. Well, simultaneously, Britain really took, in the Protestant era, took a radical divergence also from the Greco-Christian tradition. Hobbes's view was of the fallen man. So Hobbes's view was Aristotle, temperance, self-control, practical wisdom, nonsense. We'd all kill each other unless someone stops us from doing it. So the idea of Hobbes is that there is an insatiable ambition, an insatiable quest for wealth, an insatiable anxiety that only is manifested as aggression. And Hobbes famously says you need a leviathan, a strong control, to overcome the solitary life. This is something Aristotle could never have understood, because for Aristotle, the state of nature, so-called, is not solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's a community, because we are by nature social animals. But for Hobbes, we are by nature individuals that will cheat and kill each other unless controlled. It's a very dark view. And by the way, Hobbes saw himself as the anti-Aristotle. A hell of a lot of nerve, in my opinion. Who did he think he was? But Hobbes thought that he was writing the new human physics, and that the new human physics started with individuals that were against each other. And David Hume, carrying the British tradition, complicated figure. I'm told that he's more sympathetic than I read him to be. But he said also that reason, don't overrate reason. So the basic Aristotelian idea that reason is what gives us the ability to be humans, decent humans. Hume said, no, it's not reason. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. So for Hume, like Hobbes, the passions dominate. And reason is only an ex post justification, a confabulation, but not the real reason why, or not the real cause of our actions. These are very dangerous ideas in my view. And they led in a way to a very strange philosophy that came with these two gentlemen, very ingenious, but also got us really in a difficult direction. Mandeville was a pundit of his time, writing in London around 1710, and he's known for one famous, extremely clever and witty poem called The Fable of the Bees. And The Fable of the Bees is a very clever poem that says that the bees all operate with vice, but because of that, the hive becomes powerful, wealthy, and the envy of all of the other beehives. So he's writing about Britain. He's writing about the profiteering, the privateering, the stealing the Spanish galleons and all the rest. But might results from all this ambition, he says. And then Adam Smith, towards the end of the 18th century in 1776, in The Wealth of Nations, writes that it is the self-interest that causes economies to be wealthy. And of course, he writes the famous line, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love." But by the way, when you go to the butcher, the baker, or the brewer, you probably don't address it just to their self-interest. You chat with your baker, you enjoy each other, you ask how are the children, you have a normal relationship. The idea that it is only a monetary transaction is just empirically wrong. But Smith told us it's self-interest, so just go for the self-interest. Now, my view is that this variant that goes from Hobbes, Hume, Mandeville, and Smith would have been a footnote in philosophy except for one fact, which is that Britain became the most powerful country in the world. And therefore, it became a world philosophy. Because for the last 250 years, Britain was the most powerful empire in the world. And so what the British said is what I learned in school, and if you studied economics, it's what you learned in school. And it found its way into mainstream economic analysis. Of course, it's self-interest. Self-control, what is that? That's not in our theory. You're supposed to maximize. Maximize your wealth. Maximize your consumption. Your consumption is insatiable, we're taught the first day. We're never asked to explain, well, will we explode if we try to consume $1 billion of things? What will we do actually with our 19th house? And that's being put to the test by the billionaires these days. What do they do with their 19th house? Of course, they do nothing with it. They have no idea. It's interesting what Tawney, an economic and philosophical historian, wrote in a famous book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. He said, plunged in the cleansing waters of later Puritanism, the qualities which less enlightened ages had denounced as social vices emerged as economic virtues. In other words, we took ambition, we took greed, we took maximization as pleasure to be the obvious new moral virtues of the age. And we unleashed one thing for sure, and Adam Smith told us in the title rightly, we did unleash the wealth of nations. Because ambition and greed really are powerful motivators. But they are not the direction of happiness. They are a direction of wealth. But if you get wealth, you don't necessarily get well-being. Finally, this gets turned into Americana, everything for sale. Joel Osteen sells God on Sunday mornings to his televangelical audience. It is god-awful. And he says in the prosperity gospel, remember, it doesn't matter how grave your situation seems right now. if you will stay faithful and manage diligently what you have and trust God, you will achieve and experience true financial freedom. So you can be sure if you're still poor, your trust in God isn't good enough yet. God just doesn't recognize you yet, because those who do trust in God get wealthy. So if you're poor, examine yourself. Something's wrong with you. I guarantee you this is making Americans very happy. It's deadly. It's telling you every day you must have done something terribly wrong to be in the situation that you're in. And Robert Merton, one of our greatest sociologists in America, put it this way in 1938, and I think it's worth thinking about, and I know that I'm way over time. I know. So I will finish up. He said, frustration and thwarted aspiration lead to the search for avenues of escape from a culturally induced, intolerable situation, or unrelieved ambition may eventuate in illicit, illegal attempts to acquire the dominant values. The American stress on pecuniary success and ambitiousness for all thus invites exaggerated anxieties, hostilities and neuroses, and antisocial behavior. If you tell Americans that the path to happiness is to be rich, but not every American can be rich, if you tell them that if you believe enough in God, you will be rich, but you're not rich, the outcome is anomie or social deviance, exaggerated anxieties, hostilities, and neuroses, and antisocial behavior, also known as Donald Trump. So what we have in the United States is rising income and falling well-being. We've had for the last 20 years rising suicide rates, rising addictions, epidemics of opioid overdoses, despair, leaving the workforce, and soaring GDP. It just all goes to Mr. Bezos and to Mr. Gates and to Mr. Zuckerberg and to the top 1%. But we don't redistribute any of that because the poor are their own cause of suffering, and they should just do better or just believe in God more firmly or something else. And so we have an epidemic of stress and anomie, financial fraud, environmental crime, hate crimes, and addictions. It's estimated that more than 50% of the American public is seriously addicted to some harmful behavior, whether it's diet or gambling or shopping or opioids. Now, finally, let me say Aristotle is being confirmed by neuroscience too, because basically what we're learning from neuroscience is the idea is right that we have not three souls exactly, but multiple brain pathways. One of them is the mesolimbic system. It's the one that gets the rat to press the lever to get the jolt of the electrode stimulating the nucleus accumbens or the next dose of opiate to the death of the rat. Because we have a subcortical system, an animal system, which responds to pleasure. It's not a pleasure center. It is a stimulus response learning center. It's a conditioned response dynamic. But we also have the prefrontal cortex and the frontal pole. That's where we think. That's where we have self-awareness. That's where, if it's not lesioned or destroyed by addiction and trained, we can tamp down our mesolimbic system. We can say, calm down. We don't have to go for that lever one more time. And so Aristotle, he didn't even know that the brain was where this stuff was taking place. He thought it was the heart. But he was such an incredibly perceptive observer of psychology that he intuited what turned out 2,000 years later to be anatomically, neuroscientifically right, which is multiple pathways. So cognitive neuroscience is confirming the multiple pathways of choice, proheresis, that the Greeks talked about. And we also have come to understand the stress pathway, that chronic stress absolutely degrades the ability of the prefrontal cortex to execute rational thought. And the chronic stress syndrome started with young children makes it extremely difficult for young children that grow up in chronic stress to be able to have delayed gratification, to be able to have the social excellences and so forth. And this is now understood in its biological terms. Oh, there's a lot more I want to say. He's the hero. We need a new approach. We need an approach based on virtues. And Pope Francis has called this integral ecology, and I depict it this way. Again, individual virtues leading to intermediary virtues of businesses, of social relations, of politics, and of ecology. So Laudato Si is a book about virtues, but understanding virtues both on the individual level anthropologically and on the sociological level and on the ecological level as well. And Pope Francis said to world leaders, we need a plan to get out of the rut that we're in. And Laudato Si is a call for such a plan. And here is Pope Francis speaking at the rostrum of the UN General Assembly on September 25th, 2015, calling for a plan for our common home. And this is what the world governments endorsed, the world's governments endorsed the moment Pope Francis finished. By acclamation, they adopted sustainable development, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as a way for that holistic vision of combining economic sufficiency, social justice, and environmental sustainability. The team that I lead for the UN measures the progress towards the SDGs. Europe is in the world lead. This is very important because Europe has a social democratic or social market ethos, and that is a holistic approach to our politics. The top-ranked governments are Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany, France, Norway, Switzerland, Slovenia, Austria, and Iceland, ranked for the whole world. So Austria is in the top 10. It's not reaching the Sustainable Development Goals yet, but it's 80% of the way there according to the calculations that we make. We also measure well-being. Now, how do you do that? By asking people about how they feel about their lives. So it's called subjective well-being. And we report this once a year as well, based on Gallup survey. Which are the top countries in this ranking? Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, New Zealand, Canada, and Austria, number 10. The list is almost identical. Balanced societies are happier places. The United States is way down on the list of both of those. We are neither sustainably developing nor are we happy. Here we're 19th. We started out 5th 20 years ago. We're now 19th because we're falling down the list. So my proposal is that eudaimonia should become the global ethic. It's actually Pope Francis's idea, but I strongly support it. Now, what's interesting is it's not just coming from the West, but also from the East. And the first call in modern times to have a gross national happiness rather than gross domestic product was the fourth king of Bhutan in 1971. And the Prime Minister of Bhutan in 2011, Prime Minister Thigmi Tinley, gave a wonderful speech to the General Assembly calling for putting happiness at the center of the global agenda. And happily, I worked with him on this, and a few months later, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution, Happiness Towards a Holistic Approach to Development. That's where our report came from. The fact that we now have, at least notionally, a world effort to put happiness rather than wealth at the center. We need ethics throughout our institutions, and I would say ethics in the Aristotelian sense, virtuous behavior. That's true of business, it's true of the way our societies function, it's true of the way we respond to nature. And so aiming towards a global consensus starts with cultivating virtues individually and institutionally. It has to be found in a social context, not an individual context. It involves personal virtues, social virtues, business virtues, political virtues, and ecological virtues. We don't even have a language for this appropriately, but we need a language for this. And it's a matter of survival. Some of the points to achieving this would be early childhood development for all children. It would be childhood education in eudaimonia, in other words, what's called positive education. It would be the concept of global citizenship. It would be cultivating the concepts of justice. It would be recognizing the civil, economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights that are part of the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It would be ecological stewardship. It would be a holism intellectually. The Greek word for university is panestimio. Pan, everything, epistemio, knowledge. Panepistemio, what a lovely word. That is, I love universities. I entered one 47 years ago and never left. Never really got a job, but they call what I do a job. I call it a lot of fun and really lucky. But panepistemio, the idea that we need an integrated knowledge across the different parts of our world in order to have the holism of eudaimonia is crucial. And we need philosophy. We need to return to a culture of contemplation. Finally, let me note that Pope Francis has called for a gathering of economists from around the world next March in what is called the Economy of Francesco. This is not of Pope Francis, it's St. Francis. It will be in Assisi, and it's a wonderful opportunity. Pope Francis is helping to guide us towards an economy of eudaimonia. Adam Smith told us about the economy of wealth, the wealth of nations. Now we can aim for the well-being of nations. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We had a session before. Do you hear me? Yes, okay. We had a session before this session about climate change and SDGs, and I collected 3 questions that I was supposed to ask you, but 2 of them are totally inappropriate now, so I will let them be and ask you about Aristotle. In his Nicomachean 8 Ethics, the central concept is the middle. And when he talks about economic issues, he says there's a middle between squandering and stinginess. And the middle is generosity. That is one point. And the other is, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis talks about fullness. And economics only sees scarcity and never sees fullness and abundance. Could you comment on that? Because I think it really relates to what you were saying.
So Aristotle talked, of course, about the golden mean, that the basic advice he gave to his son and to all of us was moderation. it's very interesting because it's also the advice that the Buddha gave in the middle path. And basically, it is a psychological observation, not a Kantian deontological or obligatory approach. His approach is psychological, which is if you are deficient in something, you will suffer. But if you have an excess, you will become addicted. You will become drawn into an imbalance. And I think biologically, or in systems theory, we could also use the concept of homeostasis, which is a complex system needs to stay within certain operating bounds or it falls apart. We die if our temperature goes to, I know it only in Fahrenheit, to 106 or 107. A little bit of warming of our body kills us. A few little accidents take us away from our balance. So Aristotle's logic was, don't fall prey to addiction, basically. If you let the animal soul dominate your reason, you will end up spending your life chasing money, for example. Why would you want to do that? Is that going to make you look back and say, I led a kind of life that I want to lead? No. He said money's not bad. He was very practical, by the way. Nothing ascetic about Aristotle. Indeed, he said, look, contemplation requires leisure. You need wealth for leisure. So you have to be lucky to have enough wealth that you can spend the leisure time. So he was not preaching asceticism. He was not preaching degrowth, by the way. He was preaching moderation. And I think that this is really very smart psychology. The opposite is Hobbes, who says there is no such thing as self-control. That's the essence of Hobbes. The essence of Hobbes is demands are insatiable. And Hobbes explains, or thinks he explains, even if you're wealthy, then you start worrying about protecting your wealth, so you need to be even wealthier. Then you need to be even wealthier. So he says there can never be enough psychologically. But Hobbes is so pessimistic. Oh, that's the problem. Aristotle's quite optimistic. He says we're human beings, we have reason, we can behave decently. That's really the key point of Aristotle.
Okay, I have another question on Aristotle, on politics.
Yes.
There he talks about grammatistics and economics.
Yes.
And that economics is about the household, the good leading of a household, and grammatistics is about the art of making money.
Right.
And in The Common Good, you probably know that Herman Daly and John Cobb, they describe, and you describe the same thing, I guess, from this move to economics and away from, this move away from economics to grammatistic. Do you see a chance that economics get back on this other path of being really economic?
You know, Aristotle thought that making money from money was inappropriate, morally or ethically wrong. Ethically in the behavioral sense that I'm talking about, not in the Kantian sense. But he said that that's just not a good way to make a life. Trading is okay. You're trading a good for money, then you use the money to buy something else. But making money from money, he was very skeptical of. And again, he's such a perceptive person that I'm sure of one thing. We have a community that makes money from money. And I live about 5 miles from it. We live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And if you just head downtown, you get to Wall Street. And Wall Street is making money for money. The lack of ethics on Wall Street is astounding. Aristotle's psychological observation is, in my opinion, proved. They cannot understand moral boundaries on Wall Street. And I'll give you an example, just a personal example. We have a drug company, a horrible drug company called Gilead, which makes its money by charging 1,000-time markup on life-saving drugs. In my view, it's just killing people. They know it, but they are maximizing their profits. I attack them, and then I got an email from somebody who was a Wall Street trader. He said, Mr. Sachs, I don't understand what you're talking about. You're an economist. Why are you writing this? And I wrote back, I said, because people are dying because of this. And he wrote back to me, but not to yank my chain, just normal discussion. He said, but Mr. Sachs, that's our system. What are you complaining about? So he wasn't saying no, he was saying that's how it works. Because that is how it works. And that is the way to behave. And I know a lot of people on Wall Street that are just nasty in their professional behavior. I'm not talking about them as persons. I'm talking about what they tell their companies to do. Really destructive. And they are lionized in the community because they're wealthy. Because the bottom line is money. And that's the only bottom line in Wall Street is how rich are you? Of course, rich and stay out of jail. But rich and pay fines, that's fine as long as you're paying fines as a cost of doing business. And the worst of it is the hedge funds, because the hedge funds don't even have regulators. They are just to make money. So what they do is terrible things, buying the debt of impoverished, bankrupt countries at 2 cents on the dollar, and then suing these governments to say, we demand 100% repayment. And then the judges say, well, of course the poor countries should pay 100%. That's the law. And this is a way of doing business. And it's horrible. But it's not even recognized it's horrible. It's recognized as being clever.
You referred to happiness and the gross national happiness at the end of your talk. A very famous Austrian philosopher, you know, of course, Karl Raimund Popper, he warned about the dangers of happiness. In the Open Society and Its Enemies, he says, when politicians promise you happiness, it's a certain way to hell.
Right.
What do you think about that warning with respect to what you've been telling us?
I think in general, of course, social sciences made a living on unexpected consequences and on the idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think by and large the road to hell is paved with bad intentions, by the way. I'm just a little unpersuaded of always going for the unexpected consequence. We should be aware of it, but it's not the first thing we should come to mind and not the first thing we should try to get tenure on is the trick that what you think is good is bad, and what you think is bad is actually the invisible hand. It's too much paradox and not enough intention. So I'm not with Popper.
Okay.
I actually think, of course, institutionally, I'm with him that we need safeguards. We need to understand that a Stalin can come to power or Hitler can come to power. Of course we need that. Of course politicians make promises and so forth. That's true. But we should also talk about happiness. We should see what are the drivers of well-being. We should try to attend to that. And we don't right now.
Okay, so the last question from the session, I think that is appropriate. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is Aristotle. And the fact, by the way, that once I started on this path myself, which is only 10 years now, I would say, of trying to understand a little bit more of our underpinnings philosophically of what is really driving us. Because for a long time, I knew something was wrong, but I thought it could be handled at a very pragmatic level, or that I didn't feel as clearly as I should have Pope Francis's drama of the globalization of indifference, although I was ranting against it every day. I don't feel that I fully understood it, but what gives me hope is that this kind of discussion is everywhere now. It is not in power, it is not the dominant discussion, but is a pervasive discussion that we need a different approach, that we have to save ourselves from ourselves, that we can do better. I see Aristotle quoted, a letter to the Financial Times today, of course, quoted Aristotle, but that's almost a daily occurrence, which is also quite wonderful. He's been dead for 2,300 years, but he gave us a lot to think about. And what really gives me hope is we actually have a good way out. We actually have solutions. We are not at the end of the tether where everything inevitably has to collapse. We don't actually, by the way, we don't even need an economic revolution, by the way. In fact, I would say in a way, God forbid, because they don't turn out well. We need to think more clearly about what we want, about how to achieve it, about how to be nice. It's really that. We need to think about decency. We need to come back to the instinct that when you're told how many children are dying or how many kids are not in school, we say, what can we do? And then when you find out it's just that, then it should be, of course we're going to do that. Because if we can come to that world and understand for a small change, we can save so much and save ourselves. It will give everybody hope. I will actually end with an observation that I often quote of President Kennedy, who was a wonderful president, but he became a great president in the last year of his life in 1963. A truly magnificent president. And the way he became a great president was he stumbled badly for the first 2 years of his presidency because he made a lot of mistakes, the Bay of Pigs and his dealings with Khrushchev, and then Khrushchev made terrible mistakes of putting missiles into Cuba, and we almost destroyed everything. And the world almost came to an end in October 1962. And it was within, you can't even, if you haven't studied it, it's shocking how close we came to the edge. You know, there was a vote of 2-1 in one of the Soviet submarines that decided not to launch the warhead that could have ended the world. And the US doctrine at the time, by the way, was any Soviet attack would have unleashed an attack that would have killed 700 million people, and they didn't know about the nuclear winter, so it would have ended human life. So we were within just the hair width of ending everything. Well, Kennedy grew up dramatically at that moment, as did Khrushchev, at the end of 1962, and said, we can't go on like this. And he made his final year of his life to negotiate the partial nuclear test ban treaty with Khrushchev. And it's an act of will to create peace, which is a stunning act of statesmanship at the height of the Cold War. You know, to go from almost the end to a peace agreement within a few months is an act of sublime statesmanship. And what Kennedy realized was there are human beings on the other side. We can find a way to peace. And I say this because I wanted to quote a particular line, but I'm going to quote two of my favorite lines of Kennedy. He described how to make peace in a wonderful speech given on June 10, 1963. Go look it up online. It's called his peace speech. It's the most marvelous foreign policy speech ever given by an American president, because he didn't tell the Soviet Union what to do. He told the American people, we have to stop being militaristic. We have to believe in peace. Unbelievable. No American president has ever spoken like that. And when Khrushchev heard that speech, he called the American envoy and said, I want to make peace with that man. And 5 weeks later in Moscow, they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to show that peace is a matter of will. It's not a matter of fate. It's a matter of vision, of believing in the humanity of both sides. But Kennedy said a couple of things. One, he said how to get to peace. He said by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. Define the goal more clearly. Make it seem more manageable, practical, and then people will draw hope from it, and they will move irresistibly toward it. It's brilliant leadership advice. Define your goals and then make them practical. So that was the first point he made. And then he said something, and I'll end here, and I know the hour is late. He described why we can solve the problems of the planet. And he said the following, to my mind, the most beautiful lines I know of any modern statesman. He said, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we go on.